Hi, my name is Jack Nicoletti, and I'm in the studio where I'm editing my next feature film, Omega House. Omega House is a film that's supposed to look, feel, and sound like it was made in the 80s but never released. So because of this, an important part of the process was film emulation. And so naturally the first thing that came to my mind was Dehancer. I had my eye on this plugin for a while, but I never really got a chance to use it hands-on. Luckily, I reached out to the nice people at Dehancer, and they were kind enough to send over a copy in exchange for me making a review of the product. Although it is true I am making this video in exchange for a license to the software, they were very clear and upfront that all thoughts should be my own and completely honest. So that's what this video is going to be, an honest review of Dehancer. Here are a few examples from the film.
I've always wanted to do that.
I'm sorry, I don't think I get what's happening here. What I'm going to do here is show you my workflow for using Dehancer, as well as explaining some pros and cons of the software along the way. Like I said, I wanted to test Dehancer's limits, so we intentionally shot this footage with a few problems. Firstly, the color temperature is far too warm and it's pretty underexposed. The first thing I usually do is create 3 nodes. The first one will be for my basic levels adjustments, the second will be for any white balance correction, and the third will be for Dehancer. As soon as I apply Dehancer, you can see that there's a noticeable change. This is something I'm not necessarily a huge fan of, but I'll get to that later. Hands down, one of my favorite features about Dehancer is the built-in color space transform. In a lot of ways, I think it's far more simple than the stock color space transform that comes with Resolve. So we shot the film on the Blackmagic Pocket 4K, so I'm just going to select the camera and immediately it converts our footage to Rec 709. But you can see, because of those problems I mentioned earlier, it looks like a nightmare. So to fix this, I'm just going to tweak what I'm sending to Dehancer. So the first thing I'll do is go to that first node and adjust my levels, keeping an eye on the scopes to make sure everything is falling where it should. And then to make sure it doesn't look too flat, I'll drop the gamma down a bit. So now we ended up with a much more balanced image tonally, but it's still a bit too warm for my taste. So in this second node, I'm just going to lower the color temperature a bit until Bronwyn's shirt is white. So now that we fixed all our problems, it's time to get creative with the look. Jumping back into that Dehancer node, the next thing I'll do is head down to the Film tab, which is one of Dehancer's greatest strengths. The library of different film stocks you can choose from is massive. They have everything from classic home movie stocks to high-end cinema stocks. So for this film, a huge stylistic influence was Poltergeist. And I know they shot that on Kodak Vision 3, so I'm going to select that. The next tab I use is film compression. This is a very subtle effect, at least for a darker shot like this, but film compression is something that happens when shooting on film, where the highlights of an overexposed shot won't clip and get blown out like they would when shooting on digital. The film compression tool in Dehancer allows us to take those digitally clipped portions and, in simple terms, smooth them out so they don't clip or artifact like those digital cameras do. Here you could see it working its magic in this mushroom lamp behind Bronwyn. Now on to another one of my favorite things about Dehancer, the Film Print tab. For Omega House, this tab is where you could really start to see the look of the film come together. There are a few different options for different film print emulations, and I'm going to choose the Kodak 2383 stock because that's what a lot of these big studio 80s films were printed and screened on. You can immediately see that it adds more tonal contrast, bringing our shadows into the blue while keeping our midtones warm. Now, this is a little dark for my taste, but luckily there's an exposure correction slider within Dehancer, so I'm going to tweak that until everything is more balanced. The next things I'm going to talk about are halation and bloom. Both halation and bloom are naturally occurring phenomena when shooting on film that both deal with how the film stock reacts to light. This is something that I discovered much later in my film emulation journey, but in my opinion, it's one of the most important parts in selling the effect. Halation occurs when high contrast edges are photographed on celluloid film. Because of the way film takes in light, you'll see a reddish-orange glowing halo around these edges, and it's one of those things that you might not be able to see right away, but you could definitely feel it, and that goes a long way in creating an authentic film emulation from digital footage. Bloom is similar in the sense that it deals with light, but it's not about the edges, it's about the hot points. If you're familiar with a black pro mist filter, the bloom parameters in Dehancer do something similar, where it finds the points of really hot highlights and diffuses them, creating a glow that's very common with old film. Arguably my favorite Dehancer feature is gate weave. Simply put, gate weave is when the film itself shifts slightly while moving through the gate of the camera, and I cannot stress enough how hard this sells the effect. All you have to do is enable it and click the film resolution you're trying to emulate, and then you'll see that your footage bobs up and down slightly, just like real old school film. Dehancer also has this film damage tool, which is certainly one of the more stylized choices you can make when emulating film, but when subtle, I think it works great for Omega House since I'm trying to channel those classic Hollywood slashers. What's great about the film damage tool is that, like every section of the plugin, it has a custom mode, which allows you to change individual parameters so you can really dial in the look you want. The amount of customization you get is phenomenal. Now, in terms of film damage, I like dust and hair, but when I initially enable this part of the plugin, it's a bit much. It's giving me Charlie Chaplin when I'm going for John Carpenter. Nothing wrong with that, it's just not what I'm going for. So I'll just switch this from 35mm to custom, and I'll change the size and frequency of the dust and hairs. And I'm actually just going to get rid of the scratches. Now you can see that not only does this shot look like it was shot on film, but it looks like that film was well loved. Now I saved this for the end intentionally. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the film grain option, which is likely the first thing that comes to mind when you think film emulation. Dehancer's film grain is really unique in the way that it applies to your footage. Most film emulation processes involve a grain overlay, where you take some footage of noise on a gray background and simply change the blending mode. Dehancer, however, is far more of a team player. When film grain is enabled, instead of simply layering grain on top of your footage, Dehancer will actually construct your footage out of grain, which is exactly how real film looks. The result is something far more convincing than you could get with a few film grain overlays. Overall, I think Dehancer is an incredibly powerful plugin and one that I'm really stoked to have in my toolkit. I'm a fan of it not just because it emulates film, but it's a creative tool that inspires me to try new things with the footage. Now, I use Dehancer in almost everything I grade, regardless of whether or not I'm even trying to emulate film. It's a powerhouse that makes getting cinematic grade easy. That being said, there are a few cons to the plugin. The first for me is the default settings. When you initially load Dehancer, it automatically enables half of the parameters in the plugin. My issue with this is that unless you manually disable each one before you begin working, it's a bit confusing to build a look. I would prefer if Dehancer would allow me to start with a blank slate and then work my way up and build the look I want, instead of trying to guess what I've enabled and what I haven't. The other drawback of Dehancer is the amount of memory that it requires to work. Now you may have noticed that not once in this video have I clicked the play button in DaVinci Resolve, and that's because I can't without it lagging. This being said, I am on a MacBook Pro that's quickly running out of storage on account of the feature-length bloodbath I have on my hard drive, so take that with a grain of salt.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. See ya.
Regardless, this hasn't hindered me too much in my workflow because just scrubbing through the timeline will show you exactly what you're doing without any playback issues. The truth is, those are my only two critiques. I think this is an awesome plugin and it's totally changed not only the way I work, but the way I think about grading. It's clear that the developers really know what they're doing because it doesn't stop simply at grain and halation like every other plugin I've tried in the past. For example, the analog range limiter feature in Dehancer is something that I use quite frequently, and it's something I never would have thought of. For context, when you watch an old film, the blacks are never true black and the white are never true white. If you look at the scopes down here, you can see that. With Dehancer, one click of a button is all it takes to apply the same color logic to your footage, and it really sells that effect, but it's not something you'd notice at first. So all these things considered, I can truly say that Dehancer was actually the MVP of getting Omega House from my brain to the silver screen. So, that's my review of Dehancer. If you liked what you saw, you could pick yourself up a copy, and using promo code Omega House, you could get 10% off.